Hello and welcome back to DMCA Chess Academy. And this is your host, Ritesh Mathew. Today we're going to learn another technique in the end game. And at times, what happens is when you're playing a chess game and you reach in an end game and you have a pawn race where both pawns are planning to promote to a queen. And probably you have a better chance of promoting your pawn into a queen before your opponent can do that. However, your opponent is going to be just one square away from queening once you make your pawn into a queen. So how to stop the opponent's pawn is the idea that we're going to learn, the technique that we're going to learn in this video. So it's white's turn to move. He's only 2 squares away, and black's pawn is 3 squares away from queening. So once white moves his pawn to e7, let's say black moves his pawn to e3, white makes a queen first, and black is just 1 step away from becoming a queen. At this point, if you simply give up your queen to capture his pawn, then it's going to be a draw because king is going to capture your queen and it's insufficient material to checkmate. Both kings by themselves can not checkmate each other. So instead of winning this game, white ended up drawing this game. So from here, you have to remember one most important principle is your queen alone cannot attack the pawn because the pawn is protected by the king. So you need both king and a queen, your king and queen both to attack this pawn. And then the queen can capture it with the help of your king. So both of them have to attack the pawn at the same time in order for white to capture this pawn successfully. So here's the simple technique. First things first, since they are only 1 square away, so you always have to keep an eye on this pawn. He's always threatening at any given point in time. He's threatening to promote his pawn into a queen. So you cannot leave your eyes off of this pawn promotion in one move. So keep an eye on that always. And first things first, wherever the king and pawn they are, what you do is first, you're going to give a check to the king. So once you give a check, he doesn't have time to move the pawn. That's number one. And the way you're going to go is, and once you give a check, and if the king moves away from the pawn, then you attack the pawn. All right. And the way you're going to attack king and pawn is like a zigzag technique. So queen is going to go in this direction and attack both of them alternatively. So first things first. So if the king is on d file, you move your queen on d file and in a zigzag way. So come down to the d file and attack the king. Now black has a couple of choices. Either he can block his pawn or he can move away from the pawn because d file is cut off by the queen. So king can no longer stay on the d file. Now, if he moves away from the pawn, then you attack the pawn now. Because if you remember, I said you are going to follow a zigzag technique. So now you attack the pawn because pawn is on the e file. You come 1 step down on the e file. Now, obviously, the king is going to come back and safeguard the pawn because queen is attacking. Black cannot let go of the pawn. So black is going to try and attempt to put his king to d2 and safeguard the pawn. Now again, your queen cannot capture the pawn because it's going to be a draw. So once the king comes back to rescue, you come down and attack the king. And then let's say king goes away from the pawn. If the king goes away from the pawn, you follow your simple technique and attack the pawn. Once you attack the pawn, let's say the king comes back to the rescue, right? Now, again, you follow the zigzag path and attack the king. Now, what happened is queen is forking both. So queen is attacking the king and the pawn simultaneously. So now the king can no longer abandon the pawn. If the king abandons the pawn, white is going to win this game easily. So now the king is forced to block the pawn's path from promotion. Now this is where we're going to start moving our king. The moment he blocks his own pawn, we get a little breather because now he's no longer threatening to move his pawn and promote his pawn in one move. As soon as we get this breather, we're going to try and move the king because we need the king and our queen both to attack the pawn. So now you can move the king down. Now he's going to clear the e1 square for his pawn promotion again. So right away we are faced with the same threat. Now he's threatening to promote the pawn. So what we can do at this point is start attacking the king from the other side, right? And now it's the same scenario repeating. Now king can no longer abandon the pawn, because if he abandons the pawn and moves to the g1 square, we're just going to capture the pawn for free. So he's forced to block the pawn's path again. Once he does that, we get another breather. And the moment we get a breather, we are going to move our king. Now let's say he moves the king to the d2 square and he clears up the e1 square for promotion. Now again, we are threatened and he can promote his pawn. So what you can do is, now you can't go on the d3 square, but you have to check the king, right? So you check the king and go to the d5 square. So let's put the queen to d5. Now again, if he abandons the pawn, the moment he abandons the pawn and go to either c1 or c2, you're going to follow the same technique and attack the pawn. So let's say he abandons his pawn. You're going to attack the pawn again, and then he's going to come back to the pawn. You attack the king. So either you attack the king or you attack the pawn. That's the simple technique. Now, let's say he moves his king to c1, right? So now you give a check and attack the king again. Let's say he comes back. Then you attack the king because he's threatening to promote, attack the king. Now he can no longer abandon his pawn. So he's forced to go inside and block the e1 square. Once he does that, you get a breather, you move the king down. Now let's say he moves the king to f2, and now he's clearing the path for his pawn promotion. Again, now since your king is close enough, your queen can be supported on the f3 square. So now you attack the king again. Now, the same story. The king cannot abandon the pawn because black will lose the pawn for free. So again, he's forced to block the path of the pawn. Now, once he does that, your king will, you get a breather again, and your king is going to catch on to the pawn. Now, we are successful in bringing both the king and queen to attack the pawn. So now he's going to, he has only one move. He cannot move the king on the f file, so he is forced to go to d1. He can't move to d2 as well. So once he goes to d1, now we have the king support, so queen can just capture this pawn. And now we're going to capture the pawn. So this is a very simple technique. You just have to know how to stop the pawn promotion. So I hope you like the technique and practice this with the king and a pawn against king and a pawn and see if you can be successful. So thanks for watching and have a nice day.